Very much, gentlemen. I'm gonna move it along a little bit. It's 10:24, and we're trying to keep time. The panel, it should last an hour, so we're going to eat in a little bit into the networking break, and we're gonna end off at 11:20, and then there'll be a networking break from 11:20 to 11:55, okay? So now, without further ado, can I please invite on stage our first interactive panel participants, Harvey Koh, Director at Monitor Deloitte, and our moderator today, Annie Chen, founder of the RS Group. Please, come. Annie Chen, founder of the RS Group, Wolfgang Hafenmeier, Managing Partner of LGT Venture Philanthropy, Kristen Lindsay, CEO of the Global Fund for Children, and Michael Trail, CEO of Social Ventures Australia, to discuss the topic of creating social impact. And I'm sure this session will answer some of the questions that might not have been covered earlier with our Q&A earlier. So yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. First of all, many thanks to Doug and Simon and Kevin for doing such a great job at pulling this together and having the very first AVPN conference. And thank you also to our panel for joining us today. The first panel, I don't know if you'll see this on the screen. We have a suitably broad topic here, creating social impact, which is obviously what this is all about. But I think we also have a clue in the subtitle that you'll see in the topic of the conference, which is blending philanthropic and investment capital. So I think we'd like to shift from the previous session to this one to talking a little bit more about the actual wheres and whats and hows of doing this on the ground. And for that, I'm joined by a very distinguished panel who've been doing this in their day jobs. Annie Chen from the RS Group in Hong Kong, Kristen Lindsay from the Global Fund for Children, based in the US, but operating in over 60 countries around the world. Wolfgang Hafenmeier from LGT Venture Philanthropy, based in Switzerland, again, operating around the world. And Michael Trail from Social Ventures Australia. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we start, I'd like to give you a little introduction to the topic, I guess. And I'm going to start by introducing, I guess, the perspective that I bring from my work. I was born and raised in Malaysia, but I now live in this city here, which is Mumbai. And this picture is a picture of Dharavi, which some of you will know is a big slum in Mumbai. This is right on our doorsteps. Mumbai is obviously the financial capital of India. It's usually a vibrant and wealthy place, but it also has incredible poverty. Over 1 million people living in this one slum in terrible conditions. And not only is it a great social injustice, it's also a ticking time bomb. And it's a pattern that's repeated maybe in less extreme versions across Asia. And this is really what caused us to set up the work that we do at Monitor 7 years ago, called Inclusive Markets, trying to harness solutions to tackle this problem and create social impact. And the question on our minds was, could markets be part of the solution? Could we harness private sector models to housing, to water, sanitation, to improve the lives of the people around us? And I'm pleased to say, the emerging answer after 7 years of hard work is, it looks like it might work. But the reality is, two things, right? Two caveats to this is, markets are not going to be the solution to all the problems that we have. So many problems are resistant to markets. Many of the poor will remain outside markets. Many problems cannot be solved by markets. And the second caveat is that many of the models we're working with are very young. They're still innovations that are waiting to scale. And so that's the context, really, I think, for the discussion that we want to have today, because there are two worlds that often we don't think of together. The world of philanthropy, where we give money away to do good, and the world of investing, where historically we invest money to make it work hard and give us money back. But I do think that in this new world, where we're looking at new solutions, they do overlap and they do intersect, because we see that as we look for new solutions, for more impact in this world, there are some advantages combining those types of impact. I'm going to turn to the panel in a minute and ask them how they see this combination work out in the work that they do. Before I do that, I think it's only fair to describe our own interest in this. We published a report last year that described this a little bit. Our interest is really in how you pioneer new models for social change using markets. And in particular, we're really worried about how you get new pioneers to scale. And this is a very kind of simple diagram that describes how we see the journey of a pioneer firm that's developing a new model and trying to get it to scale. Two things about this diagram, right? It seems pretty obvious, but when we spoke to people about how they saw this work, they said that two things were interesting. So one was, people talk about the ends of this diagram a lot, right? People talk about the new ideas, the blueprints, the exciting innovations at the initial stage, and people talk about scaling, right? And so we named our report From Blueprint to Scale. But actually, people don't talk about the really hard work that happens in between, right? There's a lot of work to validate models, many cycles of trial and error, a lot of time, a lot of money goes into that, a lot of pain goes into that to get it right. And then often you need to prepare the market. Often public goods, infrastructure, value chains, policy are not conducive to scaling, so you've got to work on those before you can really get to scale. And the other thing that was interesting from our work was when you spoke to investors, what they really wanted to do was invest on the right-hand side when models were really proven and scaling. But actually, who was going to support them in this critical gap? So we called it the pioneer gap, starting in blueprint through to prepare, validate, prepare, where enterprises need help and support, often from philanthropic sources, because often if you invest at the early stage with these things and new models, you don't make your money back because the returns aren't big enough to cover your losses at the early stage. And we realized we didn't have to look very far in history to realize where this had happened before. Microfinance, or rather microcredit, which a lot of us now look at as certainly a model that has scaled and attracted lots of mainstream financial capital, is seen as, it's there. We forget about where it came from, though. And actually, the sector received $20 billion of subsidies over 2 decades to get it to the point where it was able to move into the mainstream and attract more financial capital. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panel and get them to describe what it is that they do. Where do they locate themselves in this slightly messy but exciting world that we live in between these two different types of capital? I'm going to start with Annie. Maybe to pick up the other mic, Annie.
Right. Am I supposed to do this, or are you going to? I'm assuming that. Okay. All right. Okay. So my perspective is really that of I suppose, capital provider in the lingo that's being used in this sector. I'm from Hong Kong. I am part of a family office, and my own journey has been kind of a traditional one in the sense that, coming from a family with a culture and a tradition of giving, when I had to take responsibility for my own portfolio, I was looking for ideas and ways of doing it, and came across kind of this idea of social entrepreneurship. So we go to this slide. You've all probably seen this a million times in different versions of this, but for me at that moment of seeing that you can actually move from a bifurcated way of thinking about how to use capital and opening up the spectrum to seeing all the possibilities in between, just giving money away versus investing for financial returns, was really opening up a new world for me. Now this, I want to keep this short because I know we want to kind of leave time for discussion. So this graphic at the bottom shows kind of the organizational spectrum, right? Of the traditional charities on one end of the spectrum and your mainstream for-profit entities on the right, and social enterprises. There are different types of organizations with a different blend of mission would be in the middle. But from my perspective, again, as a capital provider, I'm really looking at how do we as capital providers then provide the right type of funding for all of these organizations on the spectrum. So we can move to the next slide. So I just want to give you an example of how we do it. We adopt pretty much a total portfolio approach in the sense that, you know, we don't restrict ourselves into thinking that, oh, we're only a foundation, and so we only use philanthropic dollars for certain things. And we are not just your usual investor either. So we're really looking at how do we best use our resources, both time, you know, human capital, and money to create impact. So one illustration of what we're doing in Hong Kong is Hong Kong has seen, you know, a big growth in interest in impact investing, social entrepreneurship, but it's still early days. Again, you know, many little projects coming up, but how many of them are going to be sustainable? Which ones of them actually will create a lot of impact? We don't know. It's too early to tell. But what was clear to me fairly early on was that, like Harvey said, if we all just wanted to invest in the those projects that have a high chance of success, and therefore, you know, providing, even if your ultimate goal isn't the financial return, but you actually want that, right? Because you want to prove that you can actually do it and feel good about doing it. But it's too early. And what we realized that needs to happen, and the good thing, of course, Hong Kong is a relatively small place. It's got a lot of people, but we're a relatively small place. And so we can actually look at the broader landscape of what needs to happen. And so we've used philanthropic dollars to help build the space. We've supported some initiatives and also conferences that helps to promote awareness about impact investing and social entrepreneurship. We've supported some efforts to create co-working spaces to allow people to come together and talk and brainstorm. We've supported some research efforts, again, you know, just to help explain what this is all about. But at the same time, we're also looking for investments to make. And on that side, I hope Francis and I from SVHK here, I hope you don't mind my using this as an example. So SVHK, Social Ventures Hong Kong, is a Hong Kong homegrown organization involved in social innovation and venture philanthropy. They have created probably the first venture philanthropy fund in Hong Kong. And our involvement with SVHK isn't simply through investing in money into their social venture fund, but you know, they, like a lot of organizations who are really trying to break into this space, they have a dual engine model. So they have a philanthropic arm. They also have this fund that they run, and through which, you know, they promote a lot of incubation and new projects coming into the pipeline. And we understand that it's important not only to say, okay, we want to participate in the fund, and to therefore support, you know, some of these enterprises, but also to see, well, how do you actually do it? You need people, you know, to make this happen. So capacity building for SVHK was also a very important part of our support. So I think the short message that I have is, you know, if we can encourage more capital providers to again, kind of break out of their own silos a little bit in terms of how they put buckets of capital into, you know, this is for financial return, this is for giving away, and whatever, is to allow yourselves to be a little bit more fluid in terms of how you look at supporting this work.
Kristen,
Thanks.
would you like to click yourself
Would
through?
you do it? Make it
I will do it. I will do it for you.
So I thought I would explain a little bit about what the Global Fund for Children does and then where we fit on this continuum. So my fund has been in existence for 19 years, and we invest in NGOs worldwide that are advancing opportunity on behalf of the most vulnerable children. So over that course, we have invested in 500 NGOs, and at any given moment, we've got 300 groups in our portfolio, and at this moment, 40% of that work is across Asia. So we're active in 17 countries across Asia. And our approach to that is something that I wanted to spend a little time on, because the most vulnerable focus for us means that we are addressing some of the problems that have the hardest solutions to come by, and they're reaching children that are the hardest to reach. And so for us, that means children who have been trafficked, who have been exposed to war and conflict situations. It may be girls who grew up in a place where that's not a value. So places like Pakistan, where being a girl means that you can't go to school without getting shot, or other places where there's simply crippling poverty. And I think one of the dynamics that is true of Asia is that while there is incredible wealth creation going on at this moment, that has also widened the gap to the bottom of the pyramid. And so it's that base of the pyramid where we operate most of our work. And so, the slide on the screen here explains a little bit about how we do that. And we think of our core work as doing a couple of things. Our assumption about how we have impact is threefold. We look for local organizations, and so GFC is based in the States. We've got offices in several places, but our core value is that there are brilliant, local, innovative people operating in communities worldwide who have strategies to solve the problems, particularly for children, because those are their children. They wake up in that context every day determined to solve those problems, yet they have the most difficulty finding backers. And so we want to back local organizations. We also support emerging organizations to this point of pioneering work. We're looking for organizations where we can be the first institutional funder. We want to lever our investments so that that's a credential as well as capital that organizations can take forward. So we are typically the first funder. We're also working with organizations that have budgets of less than $100,000 US when we start with them. And typically their budget is about $40,000 to $60,000 US when we begin our investments with them. And the last thing that typifies our sweet spot is that they're high potential organizations. And so, they are these pioneers that have, the leaders are brilliant, they're innovative, they're committed, they're really smart. But the institutions that they're building and the problems and the solutions that they're creating are also innovative and thus have kind of replicability value. And so we're looking at a place where we can kind of maximize our investments. We invested this past year about $4.3 million in the organizations that we support. So we don't have a ton of capital, and so we want to make sure that we think carefully about where we enter the market. And we see ourselves providing risk capital. So we're taking a bet on nascent organizations, local leaders, innovative solutions, and we want to bet that those organizations can succeed and thrive if they're provided the right kinds of resources. And so let me tell you a little bit about what it is that we provide. So in order to strengthen and accelerate the growth of groups, we provide these 6 kinds of things. So we obviously scout organizations actively. We add about 30 to 50 organizations to our portfolio at any given time. So there's a part of that group that's new, the rest of them are renewing. I think more than capital, where we really add value is in the organizational capacity and the program capacity of organizations. So we have developed an extensive, what we call an organizational capacity index that is right-sized for the kinds of grassroots groups that we're working with that help them first benchmark themselves against all the dynamics that people in this room know are the hallmarks of a strong organization. What's their financial model? What are their systems? What's their reputation in the community? What does their board look like? Kind of how are they now as an organization, and what's their road forward? And so that benchmarking tool is something that we return to year in and year out, mapping their progress and identifying places where they need more help to go further. We do the same thing on the program side. And so in education, for example, a lot of times it's very easy to measure students or even matriculation rates as a measure of success. But we push our grantees to go a little further and look at things like demand for education, kind of what's ultimately going to be an indicator of real change as it relates to education. And again, that's something that we map over time. We add several kinds of financial capital. We give grants from $5,000 to $30,000 to the groups, and again, that slides up as their budget grows. We also provide capital that are sometimes the hardest things for them to get. For example, if you're in Thailand and a flood knocks out your computer system in your small organization, that can be a 2-year painful problem or a small immediate grant from us. And so we're trying to help people blow through all of the barriers that are often keeping grassroots organizations at that nascent stage because they can't overcome those small boundaries that often keep them from becoming larger organizations. We give grants for them to go speak. We give grants for people to go look at another organization. You need a child protection policy. You should take a look at this organization. They've got a really strong one. We're going to help you get there and take a look and spend several days with them. So our financial capital has a number of ways that we deploy it. Social capital is also hugely important. Introducing our grantees to other funders over time, opening those doors that, again, would take them 10 years to open is something that we spend a lot of time on. Knowledge capital, bringing our grantees together so that they can learn, bringing them into contact with experts, kind of all the ways that they're going to advance their capacity. And then finally, leverage. And leverage for us means that we are actively seeking other funders to invest in the organizations that we've invested in. So the conservative estimate is that for every dollar that we put into an organization, we are adding at least 40 cents in additional value. Some of that value is money that we help them to get, and the other is the value of the other services that we're able to provide. So what does this all add up to? And on our last slide, you'll see we look at this in 3 different ways. The first number is 28 million, and actually we're close to $29 million that we've invested in organizations over those 19 years that we've been in business. And that's a great number for us, but it's much greater if you consider that second thing, which is the ratio. And for us, the ratio of 1 to 7 is based on an analysis of how many dollars follow our dollar. So we looked at the 500 organizations we've invested in and looked at what the marketplace puts into them after we put our money in. And that's that 1 to 7 ratio. So in fact, we have deployed nearly $200 million in capital, ours and other people's, towards these grassroots organizations that otherwise would have stayed small, nascent, and struggling, that are now high-performing organizations, many of which have budgets over $1 million. And then the last number is 9 million, and that number refers to the number of children that have been reached directly by the organizations that we support. And I make the case here that supporting solely charitable organizations is a really important strategy. You're able to do it accountably with all the kind of deliberation and results that otherwise financial investments look to. But this is all upstream potential. One of the things that I learned, I heard Bill Clinton say actually, was that unless you solve this problem, the markets that you want, the employees that you need, the consumers that businesses need, and the civil society that is required for all countries to flourish won't exist. And so investing in this potential for children is where we've kind of staked out our place in the market.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And I think just to clarify for the benefit of the audience, a lot of this is all about philanthropic capital, right? You're applying a lot of the mindset and approach of investing,
Yes.
but it's all philanthropic.
Yes. Thanks.
Wolfgang.
Good morning. As Harvey said, my name is Wolfgang Hafenmeier. Can you just click? It's only 2 slides. Why not?
I'm not a very good clicker.
We have this general topic which Harvey brought up, philanthropy versus investments. We heard the question here about should someone being active in philanthropy be allowed to generate returns. I would want to come from a completely different angle. What LGT Venture Philanthropy tries to do is to increase quality of life of less advantaged people. That's what we strive for in terms of outcome. And so for us, it's more about the outcome, and then we try to identify organizations that have exactly this outcome, that they increase quality of life of less advantaged people. And at the moment, we're supporting 26 organizations, and together, at this point in time, they reach 7.9 million people. And when we do our analysis before we engage with them, we don't care if it's for-profit organizations or non-profit organizations. What we care about is that we can place money in an efficient way to reach our goal. And our goal is an outcome. And the outcome is to increase quality of life of less advantaged people. It just happened so over the last 5.5 years that we do this work with about 25 people all around the world. that about 70% of our engagements is with organizations which have a model where they can be financed with debt and equity, where we expect a financial return to come back. But we are not doing it because we can generate a financial return, but we do it because we want to place money in a way that we can efficiently achieve our mission, which is increasing quality of life of less advantaged people, and by this hopefully contributing to bring this gap of very few very wealthy people and lots of poor people closer together again. So we've tackled it from a completely different angle, I would say. We've just seen, again, when we go into the analysis, and maybe if you click once, the people who are doing this analysis is about 25 local people in different places on this world, local people in Latin America, local people in Africa, local people in India, in Southeast Asia. We have Joan with us over there. Local people in China. We have Crystal somewhere with us here. And all of these people, what they do, they constantly look for organizations that increase quality of life of less advantaged people. And nowhere on this planet I've ever read a definition of philanthropy which says you're not allowed to invest. Philanthropy means love for humankind. So the about 20 families which support us, and our largest supporter, as most of you will know, is the princely family of Liechtenstein. What our families care for is that we place their money in a way that we achieve as much impact as possible. And what we've just learned when we analyze the organizations that we look at, and an analysis normally takes somewhere around 6 to 9 months before we engage, we've just seen that the ones who do their job in a really good way, quite a few of them have models where they can generate money and where they can pay us back after a while. And I have to admit that a lot of people appreciate a partnership which is a true partnership. We don't give them money and they are completely dependent on us, but where we have an interactive partnership and we really see them as our partners where we achieve these goals together. And so I don't see this difference in between philanthropy and investment. I don't think that exists anywhere. As long as we really care for people and want to make sure that we increase their quality of life, there's different ways of doing this. And different people are doing it different ways. And for us, it just turned out that about 70% of what we do can be done in a way where we can get the money back, where we can help the organizations to grow in a strong way, in a sustainable way, where they are more independent after that, and where they can achieve tremendous impact. That's 7.9 million people that we care about. If you ask me in this spectrum which Harvey had, where we are particularly active in, we started out our activities, and that's still the core of our work, in helping organizations to be prepared and to scale, so slightly later stage, about investments per organization of 200,000 up to 10 million. We've just seen that in a few regions, we have to take higher risks. And that's when we come to what was mentioned a few times this morning. We've seen, especially in more unmature markets like Southeast Asia and China, and when I say unmature, I compare them to markets like India, like Latin America, like Europe, like Africa, where we are active as well. In these more unmature markets, you don't find enough qualified investment targets if you try to invest 200,000 up to 10 million. So we said we have to go one step earlier. And that's, in the end, I think your phase, in the end, validate, you would call it, where we have built accelerator programs, and we've heard another buzzword this morning, collaboration. Again, we said we take more risk with the acceleration program, but we want to collaborate. And you see quite a few of our partners. CSIP is here today, where we partner together in Vietnam. You've seen Sunit from Change Fusion, where we partner together in Thailand. You might have seen people from GEPI here. Rico from the Philippines is not here today. You've seen Calvin from Transist in China. This is our local incubation partners, and together with them, with our local team members, with additional people in our team there, who then try to identify very young social enterprises where we would invest up to 50,000, but where we would provide a lot of you would call it capacity building, we would call it management know-how, to help them validate their model and hopefully come to a stage where later on then we could invest in them out of our core portfolio. But on top of working and collaborating with these partners in these countries, and we're doing the same thing in Brazil, in Colombia, and in Mexico with partners. On top of this, we said we have to collaborate also with local mentors, because these young social enterprises, they need mentors. So we've built a network of local mentors. And what we've done as well, or what we're about to do, is to build a network of local social angel investors. Again, collaboration. We're open to share our due diligence. I mean, anyhow, it's very high risk to invest in these young social enterprises, so they will need the support of mentors, they will need the support of other social angel investors, because for sure we're going to get into trouble with quite a number of them. We can do the best analysis of this planet, we still will face issues. That's true for every growing organization, and we have to make sure that the ecosystem which we can build around these young startups is strong enough so that they will get through these difficult phases. And in the end, that's what we do today. We're very active in this acceleration work, and our core work is still to mainly invest in organizations which need about 200,000 up to 10 million, and a lot of management know-how because they're in strong growth phases. Just the last point, based on what we learn while working with these organizations on the ground, these learnings we take and do very active advisory, especially for families who want to get active in this space or want to improve their activities, because we've seen that there's a lot of demand of people out there who want to know the intricacies of our day-to-day work, which we have when we do our job, and not just read up in books the very general statements which you can read everywhere. And that's why over the last 2 years we built a family community where there's peer-to-peer exchange within these families and where we contribute with our know-how from on the ground.
Great, thank you. Michael?
Thanks,
you're going to buck the trend.
Yeah, I'm ex-private equity. I'm a control freak, mate. I'll have that sucker. But if I stuff it up, it's coming right back at you. I wanted to thank the OVPN for putting this on. On behalf of my Australian colleagues, and there are several here, we don't quite win the prize for coming the furthest, but in an Australian context, we do feel a long way away, and I think one of the things that's been deeply informing and inspiring for us is to have the opportunity to connect to what's happening globally. And I want to thank Doug in particular. I think in the next generation, impact investing will be recognised as a respected asset class, and there'll be a small handful of people who can claim to have had their footprints on that. Doug won't, but he should, because he's been one of the people who's really made sure this has become a global trend. And in terms of quick personal professional background, I'm a self-diagnosed reformed investment banker. I was a co-founder of Macquarie Bank's original, what grew into a $500 million private equity business. The organisation that it's been my privilege to be involved in was founded in 2002, Social Ventures Australia. It started as a venture philanthropy model, and from listening to Kristen and Wolfgang, very much that idea of trying to identify particularly programs focused in Australia, clustered around education and employment. Why? Because if you look at Australia's generally good economic performance, we're a bit of a disaster in terms of the underachievement for people who are struck in what we call postcodes of disadvantage. And we've grown to a point where we have an annual funding base of 10 million, a phenomenal group of over 50 people, a lot of whom, like me, are kind of corporate refugees out of the consulting investment banking background. We do have a bit of ballast in that. My colleague, Kevin Robbie's in the audience. He's a Scottish social entrepreneur, so he has a great way of cutting through the consulting BS and keeping us grounded in what really matters. We have, in terms of our annual funding mix of about 10 million, that's a hybrid of high net worth funding, corporate foundations. We set up a consulting and a social finance team. They work on a cost recovery basis. And while there's an element of be careful what you wish for, we do have a small component of government funding. And what I wanted to share was a quick case study example, and this was really in the spirit of responding to Doug and Paul's challenge about scale and what that takes and what that means. And the case study example, it's not me, is a story of a bankrupted childcare chain that grew pretty aggressively. This was about an organisation that grew out of private ownership at its peak. It had a market value of $2.6 billion. It was the ABC childcare centre chain. They had over 1,000 childcare centres. At their peak, they had a market value of about $2.6 billion, $1 billion in bank debt, and it became a very famous or infamous Australian business story when that flamed out and went into bankruptcy in late 2008. We had an interesting opportunity. For those with a financial markets memory, you'll recall that as being not a particularly easy time in terms of capital access. And there was an idea, not from me, but from a guy called Evan Thornley, who's an interesting business and social entrepreneur in Australia, who called me just after this business went broke and said, mate, have you had a look with your social ventures, impact investing, social finance hat on at ABC? I'm not that creative, and so I said no, but I'd learnt to listen to Evan. And he said, well, if you actually think about it, all of your old private equity colleagues are hunkered down in a bunker, putting band-aids on businesses they've stuffed up. There's probably not going to be a lot of competition for this business when it gets sold. And if you could actually raise the money, this is arguably a once-in-a-generation opportunity to acquire a chain of childcare centres, and it was a very big business. At that point, turnover north of $600 million, over 70,000 kids in the centres, staff of 14,000. And we knew that to be serious, we'd have to really get on the bike in terms of raising the capital. What came out of that conversation was a pretty unlikely alliance in one sense of 4 Australian non-profits. And we were committed to the idea that actually if we could do this at scale, we could run this with business disciplines but for social purpose. And I think I'm preaching to the converted in many in this room, but all of the education and research will tell us that the earlier you invest in children from disadvantaged backgrounds, the higher the social return. It is off the chart. And in Australia, we don't do that particularly well. So that was the kind of galvanising idea. There are a lot of naysayers around that who said, yeah, nice idea, a bunch of do-gooders from the non-profit world. No way you're going to be able to raise the money. There were several who said business is really hard, social purpose and non-profit's really hard, trying to combine both, you're in fantasy land, not going to work. But we, over a period of time, persisted, imbued by this idea that this was actually possible if we could raise the money. And the way we did that, I seem to have lost a slide here. Can you take this back, please? So the way we raised this money you see before you, and I think this actually is a practical case study example that gets to Paul and Doug's challenge of how we can think about doing this at scale. There is no way we would have raised the $165 million we needed to complete this acquisition, and we were announced as the successful bidders in around Christmas of 2009 without a cocktail capital structure that drew from government, drew from the conventional business world, and drew from emerging social impact investors. So if you look at that capital structure, we raised $120 million in debt, conventional debt from the National Australia Bank. We had $15 million from the federal government. That was a loan. The irony in this, and I think this picks up some of the challenges around engaging with government, they said at many points to us it would have been a lot easier for us to have asked for that as grant money rather than debt money, which struck me as absurd. But that 15 million was in debt, then 30 million of what we call social capital. So I'm not going to get into the debate war about this, impact investing, what the hell is it? It's a debt instrument that pays a 12% coupon, quasi-equity, call it what you will. And it was that at-risk capital that enabled us to raise the $165 million. We finished up paying a net $95 million for a business this year that will generate north of 40 million in cash flow. And the skeptics were wrong, because what's actually happened while we're... I spent 13 years in private equity, so I'm not sufficiently stupid to declare victory too early, but we're 3 years down the track and this business is significantly ahead of target in terms of its cash flow and business metrics. The structure, conscious structure of this transaction is such that any surplus capital is redirected into the organisation to focus on disadvantage, to improve the quality of teaching and training. And so those social capital investors have received their 12% coupon, and we think we're in pretty reasonable shape. This is 15% of the market. While what we're doing we think is good in and of itself, my original training was in economics. The way I frame it, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for social change if that's all we do. We have to engage with government at a policy and funding level. There's no question that in terms of changing the whole landscape of early learning, the opportunity out of Good Start is a pivot point to do that, and that's what we're trying to do. My closing takeaway before I hand back is I gave a TEDx talk a couple of weeks ago, and if you actually look at the mass of this and the opportunity that exists for all of us and globally, there's a lot of scepticism about scaling this market. And our view is that there's a spectrum of deals which can do enormous good where there's no financial return, and at the other end of the spectrum there are a lot of opportunities like Good Start where financial and social returns are not incompatible. They're not. And if you do the maths, in an Australian context, there's $1.5 trillion in pension funds. If this was a legitimate asset class and 2% of that was invested in impact investing, we would liberate $30 billion of funding in Australia to do more than 30 Good Starts. And if you think about any sector of the economy where there's revenue generation, social policy purpose and a government imperative to be involved in the long term, that's big chunks of the economy. And that's not just I think that's a genuine global opportunity. And the PS in all of this, as anybody who looks at the financial pages knows, in an Australian context, the average return on pension funds, managed pension funds, annually for the 10 years to December last year was 4.4%. So for those Luddites who said you can't do business disciplines for social purpose, you'll prostitute and compromise your fiduciary duty of care to pension owners, bullshit.
Thank you. Mike, I'm actually going to follow up with a question. So on the topic of blending capital, right, so the latest chapter in Good Start story is obviously funded by return-seeking capital, right? That's the story you've told. But actually, if you go back to its history, there's blending of different types of capital in creating that business. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sorry, the question's about the blend of capital?
About the blend of capital earlier in Good Start's history.
So the mix was very explicitly that we had to solve a problem around getting the at-risk capital, and there's as much art and science in this. So, I mean, in my prior life, a good private equity return would be of the order of 20 to 30%. So the pitch around the capital notes was that we thought 12% was a reasonable return. It's clearly significantly above a risk-free premium. And in truth, I think the pitch was in part, we think the numbers of this stack up. We raised $22.5 million from 41 institutions, but mostly high net worth social investors, and they responded positively to the proposition that we want our money back, we want a reasonable return, but we would love to see you do real social good. And I think our view is that in the emerging market, and I saw and lived and breathed this in private equity, in the early days you're dependent on early adopters. The early adopters won't be institutions. Our next challenge, and I think the challenge for others in the room, so for example, we've just been involved in Australia's first social benefit bonds. We've already got one institutional investor in that with an indicative return of 7 to 13%. We want more. The way we get to that 30 billion number here and globally is convincing the institutions who are typically conservative that this is a legitimate asset class and the risk return profile is reasonable. So we're taking a 10-year view of how we try and build that, but you've got to go where the money is initially, and I think those early adopters will be high net worths and foundations.
Wolfgang, could you help us with this question as well about blending capital? So I think some of the challenge that we've had as we've gone out and talked about blending capital is it all sounds great in theory, right? But if you're talking about actual enterprises and markets that are taking, on the one hand, grant money that is being given away and that people expect to be written off and can be used extreme, risk-bearing capital. On the other hand, you might have capital that demands a return, maybe a commercial market rate return. How do those coexist? How do we manage the coexistence of those different types of capital within the same sector and maybe even within the same company?
Most probably no right or wrong answer to this question because we've seen all different things. Some of them work, some of them don't work. I mean, there's a few examples where we did our analysis about companies in Africa, for example, and once we've been almost at closing, they took our due diligence and have gone to European foundations and got the money for free. Well, you could say blended capital in a sense. We wanted to invest and they took the cheap money, got it. These cases happen and they will happen as long as you have these different players in the market. Now you find others who might say, well, maybe with such an investment from our side comes a little bit more than money, and that's what we would hope for. And to appreciate the management know-how and the networks which come along with such an engaged approach as we have it, where our team members normally spend half a day to a day per week with the senior management teams. But that's not true for everyone, obviously. I mean, with Simon from Shell Foundation, somewhere up there, I think, that's one of these examples which I personally, in general, don't like, honestly, but which worked extremely well in a particular case in India, where the Shell Foundation was key for an organization called Husk Power Systems, where they injected grant money at the beginning and helped, in the end, Husk to validate their model in your terms, and where then, well, Eric was sitting next to him, ourselves, and Acumen, then later on helped Husk Power to grow from 80 biomass plants. I mean, Husk Power Systems is providing electricity to very remote places in northern India, in Bihar, and they have grown over the last 3 years from 8 plants, and that's been the 8 plants that Shell Foundation funded. They have grown with investment capital then later on from 8 to 80 plants and are on a good way to even grow further. And it's still somehow blended in a sense that you have these 3 main investors in there. And you have still Shell engaged who tries to see how they can support the ecosystem around. Can they provide training, universities around? So there it's a very beneficial coexistence, I would say. Whereas then we have also seen cases where companies started to work with grants, like in this case, and where the management teams got so spoiled by these grants that it was just impossible to later on work with real investments there. So I would say we've seen all kinds of different mixtures. Some of them worked and some of them didn't work. In the end, it depends a lot also on the grant funders. How responsible are they when they do these early stage grants? I mean, there is a huge difference in just handing out the money and letting them do whatever they want to do, or tying it to very clear milestones and making very clear what someone expects working with them, and training them in a way that they're accountable for what they do, that then later on they're really prepared for real investments. So it depends a lot on which parties are involved. And obviously the same is true then later for commercial money which comes in. I mean, we've seen very positive examples where there have been responsible social investors who did a good job, and we've seen other cases where I would say the companies should have never taken on this commercial money, where it destroyed the whole culture in an organization and did a huge disservice. That's why I'm saying there is no black and white answer, and that's why it's not so easy to answer a question like the one we heard before, should there be investments or not? Because it depends always a lot on the individuals who do this stuff and how diligent they do and how responsible they do their work, I would say. Well, let's say in all of these different categories, I would say we've seen positive and negative examples over the last couple of years.
Thank you. Sure, Christian, please jump in.
To build on that a little bit, I mentioned in my slide that there's this 1-to-7 ratio of dollars that follow ours into the organizations, and the mix of capital there is really interesting to us. And so there's one example of an organization that we supported in Bangladesh that had, a great idea. Schools needed to be on boats because monsoon season was wiping schools out increasingly much harder and much faster. And the entrepreneur that started that organization had $30,000 of his own capital, a really solid organization idea, and 1 boat. And we invested in him then, and after 3 or 4 years, he had 4 boats. And after another year, we were able to introduce him to the Gates Foundation, because Gates at that moment was looking for organizations like that, expanding educational access. And so they were able to receive a $1 million grant from Gates, graduated out of our program. And so for them, the scaling up required them moving from us, that helped build this kind of base of accountability, results, strong management practices, to a larger funder. Whereas we've got another organization we're supporting in Mumbai that supports night schools. Night schools are a necessity. I can't solve that problem of child labor. However, we can support organizations that are investing in better quality night schools. And the group we support there has innovated a curriculum, a practice of education gone from being a $2,000 organization to now having 14 schools that it operates, high quality, and its next move is to try to get government to adopt its curriculum in 4 additional states. Interestingly enough, government doesn't want to spend its money on this solution, and so they're looking for private capital to expand their investment even further. And so, you know, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that we provide risk capital. We do all of those other supports as a way to manage our own risk to make sure that that money is put to good use. But in the end, what I'm doing is absorbing risk on behalf of other institutions that can then come behind me and invest in organizations that have been vetted and solidified. And so there's different ways to answer that question. Ours is both government and public sector money.
Annie, I saw you nodding vociferously there when Wolfgang was talking about the discipline of the funder, you know, in giving grant funding to enterprises. Maybe it would be good to get your comments on that. And I think also the other thing I think was really striking about your story in terms of how you work is your lens on the sector, as it were. We spent a lot of time talking about individual enterprises and ventures that can be really powerful and that can scale to serve lots of people. But actually, there might be a really powerful role for philanthropy in creating sectors and ecosystems as well, and it feels like that's something you've been doing in Hong Kong.
I can't really speak to actually, you know, the discipline of grant making. I don't think I'm actually a very good example, and that's why hiring good people is so important. I know we have a session later on about talent and all that. I'm definitely going to that one. I guess it's partly, you know, as I was sharing at a roundtable yesterday, I think partly it's because, you know, I kind of approached this without any prior baggage, both intellectual or experience baggage, in terms of, like, you know, I'm not an investment professional by training, neither was I a philanthropic, you know, person. I mean, in the sense of having run a foundation or anything like that. So I came with an open mind as to, you know, what I wanted to do, and then just seeing that, of course, you know, there's a belief that this space is important, that the time has come you know, to really nurture the space and unleash the potential. But it doesn't happen by itself, and you know it'll grow. I'm fairly certain about that. But it's about the pace of growth, and can you accelerate that somehow? Because the needs and the issues are very urgent. And I think also within the context of Hong Kong, because it is a fairly limited place. You know, it's a small, relatively small city, as I said. There aren't that many people, right? And if you really are serious about it, you'll get to meet the key actors and all that. And so in a way, it's not that difficult. You know, once, of course, you know, once people know that you're kind of interested in that, they'll come knock on your door anyway. And of course, there is a process of hoping that, and, you know, due diligence and getting to know the people, but I think the getting to know the people is the most important part, as opposed to you just looking at the organization and doing that kind of due diligence. And you know, as I said, I think because it's early times, and so it's not as if, you know, you're faced with hundreds of potential candidates or people that you can work with. So it was relatively a small pool that we were working with. So it made that a little bit easier. I mean, it sounds pretty impressive, but you know, you have to take into the context that it's not like, you know, talking about a country or a really huge city. But I think because we were talking to a whole range of people in the early days, that exposed us to all the needs, and then you start seeing the connections between, you know, the needs in the different areas, and realizing that, you know, you can't just support one and say, you know, I only like this or I only like that. You can do it, but again, you know, not really advancing the whole ecosystem very much. So, you know, there was talk or mention yesterday about kind of collective impact, you know, at a large scale, right? That's about collaboration and getting people who are focused on particular issues to bring what they can to the agenda and working together. I was relatively fortunate in the sense that, I had to hold myself accountable. I want to be able to explain to people, what I do eventually, right? Because otherwise you don't have good examples. If you fail, then it's like, not that I have a problem with failure, but then, you want to give people confidence as well. But then I wasn't hamstrung, I was very struck by Lawrence's talk earlier about, in the context of a family foundation, there are other stakeholders that you have to convince. And I was relatively lucky in the sense that, I could do my own thing. So, if you're in that position of being able to make decisions on your own, right, I think make use of it. And, just break down the silos that you have within your head about, how you do this.
Thanks, Annie. For those who are wondering, that was the 15-minute warning rather than some 10-minute warning. Okay. Actually, just to respond to that, Annie, I think the thought that you sparked off in my head was this whole notion of adapting what we're trying to do to the realities of where we're operating, right? So if you're in a market which is, actually, Wolfgang, you made this point too, if you're operating in a market which is relatively underdeveloped and not very mature, you may have to cut your cloth to fit. Reminds me, actually, the early years of working with the One Foundation, who I see friends from here in Dublin in the early years, trying to adapt the new profit model to Ireland, a country of 4 million people, and finding their only, seeking to find the brightest and the best to work with, and there are only 3 organizations in the sector to look at and to work with. So those are the realities. Right, so let's open to questions. I think what we might do is just try to do one round of a few questions, and then put those to the panel so you get to get out for your coffee break. So let's have 3 questions. Hands, yes. Man in the middle here. Like to go to a mic or go for it? Go for it.
Amir here, I come from India. My question, starting off with something you said, was that just as there is this problem of organizations that are too small to scale up, is there a problem of organizations that are too large to fail? The reason I'm asking this comes from that slide that you put up on microfinance. That was a great example of a large, scaled-up system that needs $20 billion of subsidy. What do we do when we reach that kind of a scale and realize we've all failed?
Is that because you think it has failed, or?
I don't know, I'm asking you that question.
Okay, okay, has it failed?
Yeah,
And has scale been a part of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Great question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Su Chen. I came from Beijing, and I'm working with the Lotus Foundation in charge of the Social Innovation Forum. And my question is, either impact investing or venture philanthropy, both of them, for both of them, the major challenge will be lack of real sourcing and successful case studies. So, what are your main suggestions to correct and improve such challenges for venture philanthropy and impact investing? Thank you.
Great question. What do we do about the lack of deals, lack of successes, lack of successful exits, I think a lot of people would say in this field? One more? Yes? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Asim. I'm a co-founder of Give Singapore. It's a crowdfunding platform for social causes. The question I had was, we are seeing increasingly democratizing happening in a lot of different sectors where what was available to just 1% of the population is opening up to the rest of the 99%. So I would like to ask if you're seeing any new initiatives and opportunity areas where we can open what is available to mostly 1% of the people to 99% when it comes to venture philanthropy. Thank you.
So democratizing access to services, is that, was that the question?
I think what I really mean is that instead of venture philanthropy investment being open only to high net worth individuals, is there a possibility to involving the rest of the 99%?
Great, thank you. one more hand. We can take one more, yeah.
So my question really is in the context of venture philanthropy, oftentimes we hear people talk about innovation. So the term is used now over and over. So when something is new or novel or different or be creative, and then we say, okay, it needs to be innovative. But the question really, are we overemphasizing that aspect of the philanthropic work by keeping asking the organization to be innovative, when in fact a lot of the work is done not because it's innovative, it's out of needs. So chasing innovation could have a counterproductive effect. So my question for the panel, actually for everybody here, how do we really look at innovation in the context of venture philanthropy?
Great, thank you. 4 excellent, excellent questions. So just to recap for the panel, the first one is, do models get too large to fail or get too large and then fail as a result of scaling? Great question, reference to microfinance. The second is, what do we do about the lack of deals and successes in this space? And I would say that's probably venture philanthropy, maybe even more impact investing than venture philanthropy. The third one is, could we democratize it, maybe have retail venture philanthropy, create access for many more people? And the fourth is, what is the role of innovation? Do we sell ourselves short by just chasing innovation at the expense of other types of work? Let's start. Michael?
So at the risk of doing those questions a disservice and trying to aggregate them, they all to me get to the fundamental issue of how we try and build a mature market infrastructure in space where there's serious capital inefficiencies. So the picture that I think we want to get to, let me do 2 things. One is, I come from private equity background. Whatever the warts of the business world, there is relatively seamless capital access based on performances of business. So if Wolfgang comes to me with a startup business and he's got family money and it does well, I might provide him with venture capital. That business might then publicly list on a stock exchange and access debt. That is all based on continuous metrics of cash flow, return on shareholders' funds. What we do in the non-profit world is a dog's breakfast. And so I think the keys are, we have to have clarity of evidence about 2 key things. One is financial performance and the other is social performance. And if we don't unbundle those things, we get this messy debate about where financial returns either get overstated or we undersell the social purpose. The key, I think, in Good Start was that there was unanimity of view, and it was the old Sisters of Mercy line, no money, no mission. So we had to focus first on the business disciplines to get financial results. If we did that, we could then do profound good. So I think we should start with that premise if we want to build a financial market. 3 quick things. One is, I agree with the gentleman about the significance of case studies. I'm acutely conscious in Australia that if, for example, a Good Start doesn't work, we've probably set the market back by about a decade. So the early examples have got to work and work well. The second I spoke about, which is clarity of evidence. And I think the third thing, which gets to this issue of scale, I get asked a lot, what are the differences between the business world and the non-profit world? My answer is invariably, I think the concept of scale is quite different. In Good Start, for example, if we don't have outstanding centre management, local community support, the business fails. Now that's much more challenging across a network of 654 early learning centres than it ever was in my prior business life, where we invested in a bunch of retail businesses, where if you had good systems, good head office and a B-grade manager and a good site, the business would still do okay. In the community sector, local community engagement is profoundly important, and if we don't do that well, we will never build the market.
Which one? All of them? So I choose. Just to be a little bit more critical, I mean, this whole democratization through crowdfunding, I think if we talk about investments, and when I talk about investments, then I talk about things where we expect a return. When I'm observing what's happening on the regulatory front, I think that's just a dream to democratize, honestly. I think we're rather going in a different direction globally right now, where there's more and more regulation happening and where it will be more and more difficult for retail investors to really invest in these things. And as intermediaries like ourselves, we have to be extremely careful. I mean, if I would tell you here that I'm fundraising for 2 funds, that's not legal anymore. So, I mean, from a regulatory point of view, what we've seen over the last 12 months happening goes in a completely different direction, completely away from democratization of investing in these things. As long as we talk about grants into these things, that's no problem, but personally I don't think that there is a large market out there. In terms of innovation, honestly, when we started, and I think that's still true, you'll not find the word innovation once in our materials because we have never been interested in innovation. What we're looking for is good solutions to improve quality of life of less advantaged people. And if an existing solution works and I can scale it, well, perfectly fine. On the other side, one has to admit that the social environmental problems on this planet are growing, and if we would have all the solutions already there, well, most probably we wouldn't have that many issues. So I think we will need a few new solutions, and it's good that there is innovation around, but we should not focus on innovation, and the least thing we should do is only invest in super innovative things. So I think very often it can be super interesting to invest in organizations which have just a good solution and where we can help them grow tremendously. Help them grow tremendously leads into too big to fail. Honestly, we've seen in the banking sector that there should be no too big to fail. I mean, in the long term, it's more healthier if organizations fail. If they don't have a real value add and no one is willing well, to pay for the services, and when I say no one, that means could be funders, that could be the people who buy these services, that could be government. If no one sees the value add in this organization or thinks they're not doing this in an efficient way, well, maybe it's better they fail. And maybe it would have been better if a few large banks would have failed over the last couple of years. So for me, there's nothing wrong with failing, honestly. If there is no value add, then that's fine. Then there will be other solutions who hopefully will solve the problem in a better way. And this whole notion of too small to scale or whatever, I mean, we have to be honest, venture philanthropy, and when I talk about venture philanthropy, I'm talking about applying venture capital principles to the philanthropic space, which for me means that we look for young, strongly growing organizations. And like venture capital is a small segment of the commercial investing market, venture philanthropy will be a small segment of the philanthropic space, and there will always be organizations which should not scale, which have good local solutions, which are needed, which are necessary, which is a different segment of the market. Not everything has to be venture philanthropy. I mean, that's just a complete misunderstanding. I hope that we are in a phase in this whole philanthropic impact investing space where we see more and more interesting segments emerging, and all of these segments have different purposes and are good for different things. Well, successes. I mean, we've heard this morning embracing failures. That's fine, that's good, that's needed. At the same time, we have to celebrate a few successes. I think there is successes out there. It's not 100,000 successes out there because, again, we have to be honest to ourselves. If we look at the money which is invested in space so far, it's not an awful lot of money which is invested in this space. So according to the amounts invested, that's the number of successes that we have. And if we talk about long-term engagements of 5 to 10 years, we should not expect that we will see the successes like every day. It just takes time. But there is successes out there. I mean, the landscape is full of successful ventures.
You know, I think of two things. I think of, you know, the fact that we're working with organizations that are not too big to fail. They are often too small to survive. And so, you know, our infusion of capital is intended to help those groups flourish. And it's not to the point of innovation just looking for sparkly new things. But innovation is defined locally. And what our work requires is a lot of trust that local people have ideas that are both relevant and worth supporting. And as with venture capital, only a small number of those are going to flourish to become the next big thing. But still supporting that work at its level is, in our world, it's the right thing to do. I also think that there is a scale bias. And so, in venture philanthropy conversations, and this may be contrarian to the group that I'm speaking to, that there's this assumption that you have to scale or you have failed. And scale is set to, kind of go big or go home. And I think that scale is relative. And for the organizations that we see, sometimes scaling is going from 1 state to 4 states in India. And to try to go beyond that, you set yourself up for failure. But to go to those 4 states means that you're doing a tremendous job and ultimately can gain traction that will see change in other ways. And so that's how I think about those questions.
We're kind of out of time. Okay, I'll just say one thing then. Again, from the point of view of a capital provider, this is a little bit to a question that came up earlier about, in venture philanthropy, should investors expect returns? I think it just points to the importance of, if you are an investor, and I don't care whether you think of yourself as being active in the VP space or impact investing space, but it's really understanding yourself and what you're looking for, and being truthful about that, and not being led by what the person next door is doing. Because if the clearer you are about what your objectives are and what you want to get out of supporting a particular project or investment, the higher the likelihood that you will find a good match, right? Because if you're expecting returns and you invest in a model that actually is not likely to generate that return, you're not going to be very happy.
Great. Thank you all very much. So just in closing, I'm just going to pick up the 2 things very, very quickly. I think it brings us back to impact, right? What is this all about? It is about achieving impact on the problems that we care about. Why are we interested in innovation? Because we're looking for new and better ways of having that impact on very, very tough problems for which ready solutions don't exist. Why we're interested in scale, and maybe it's not scale of an enterprise or even of a model, but scaling impact to the scale of the problems, right, that we're facing. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much to our panelists. I hope this has left you with lots of questions more than answers, because you should take that into the sessions that follow this. But also I think, given that this is the first AVPN conference, I would echo Doug and echo Lawrence in saying, challenge yourselves not just to move this forward in your own work, but help us build the field, help us answer some of these questions for which we have no ready answers. Thank you very much.